Have you ever felt that shiver when you're home alone at night? When the silence seems too heavy and suddenly small details start to make no sense? In this horrifying and true horror story, you'll meet Lucas, a young man who faced his worst nightmare when he realized he wasn't so alone after all. Stay with me until the end and discover the secrets he could never have imagined. And remember, the next one to experience this could be you. So get ready to feel your heart race, because this night will be unforgettable. First story. The bow, half-open door, the nightmare of a lonely night. Let's start this mysterious story, but first quickly check if you're already subscribed to the channel. This way, you can be sure that you won't miss any of the most chilling stories that we have prepared, especially for you. Continuing. Lucas parked the car in front of the building, feeling the tiredness of the entire day of work weighing on his shoulders. The rain was already starting to fall, creating small rivers on the sidewalks, and thunder echoed in the distance like a prelude to something dark. He looked at the clock. 11:45 p.m., too late for anything other than taking a quick shower and throwing himself into bed. The cold night wind enveloped him as soon as he got out of the car, making him adjust his jacket as he climbed the steps to the building's gate. The place was old, with peeling walls and lamps that flickered constantly, as if hesitant to light up the space. He felt safe there, or at least he used to. As he entered the building, the sound of his footsteps echoed through the empty hallway. The absence of voices or noise from the neighbors was unusual, but he ignored it, attributing it to the late hour. Reaching the apartment door, Lucas stopped for a moment to search for the key in his pocket. That was when he realized something was wrong. The door, which he always locked carefully, was ajar. A dark crack revealed the interior of the apartment. He frowned, feeling his heart race. Did I forget to lock it? He thought, trying to rationalize. But uneasiness took hold of him. He knew he never left the door like that. Cautiously, Lucas pushed the door open with his fingertips. It opened slowly, with a soft creak that echoed in the silence of the apartment. The darkness inside seemed denser than usual, as if something was waiting in the shadows. "Hello?" he called, his voice coming out softer than he expected. No answer, just the steady sound of the rain outside and the soft dripping coming from the kitchen sink. He hesitated before entering, but a thought made him move forward. This is my house, there's nothing here. When he turned on the living room light, he noticed that everything was apparently in its place. The sofa, the table, the books stacked on the shelf. Nothing seemed to have been touched. Even so, he couldn't ignore the feeling that something was wrong. He closed the door behind him, making sure to lock it this time, and began exploring each room. With his cell phone in hand, using the flashlight to illuminate the darkest corners, Lucas went to the bedroom, then to the kitchen, and finally to the bathroom. Nothing. No sign of a break-in or strange presence. Despite this, the shiver on the back of his neck wouldn't go away. Back in the living room, he threw the keys on the table and sighed deeply, trying to convince himself that it was just paranoia. But deep down, something told him that this night wouldn't be like the others. If you want, I can continue with the next topic. Just ask. Lucas finally threw himself onto the couch, trying to relieve the tension that seemed to have settled in every muscle in his body. The room was plunged into an uncomfortable silence, broken only by the soft sound of rain hitting the window. He picked up the remote control and turned on the television, trying to fill the room with some familiar noise. But as he flipped through the channels, a distant sound caught his attention. At first, he thought it was just a creaking noise from the old building, something common on rainy nights. But as he lowered the volume of the TV to hear it better, the sound became clearer, a slow, repetitive scratching, like nails sliding over wood. His heart raced, but he tried to stay calm. It must be the wind, he muttered to himself. himself, even though the explanation didn't make sense. The sound seemed to be coming from the hallway that led to the room. It was low, almost imperceptible, but persistent. Picking up his cell phone again, he turned on the flashlight and stood up, moving with careful steps toward the hallway. The darkness seemed heavier there, as if the light from the lamp in the living room didn't have the courage to follow him. "Who's there?" Lucas asked, trying to sound firm, but his voice came out shaky. Silence was the only answer, followed by another sound. This time, something falling to the floor, coming from the bedroom. Lucas's heart felt like it was about to jump out of his chest. He paused for a moment, considering his options. He could run away, call the police, or check what was going on. Against all logic, he chose the third option. He needed to know what was there, even though every fiber of his being screamed at him to do the opposite. When he reached the bedroom door, he found it ajar, just like the front door had been. He gripped the handle firmly and pushed it open, slowly. The beam of the flashlight revealed a seemingly normal environment. The bed was made, the wardrobe closed, but on the floor next to the bed was what had fallen, a picture frame. It was a picture of him and his mother, taken years ago. He bent down to pick it up, but as he did so, he heard another sound. This time, it was a whisper, a muffled, incomprehensible whisper coming from the darkest corner of the room. Lucas froze, his eyes fixed in the direction of the sound. The flashlight beam trembled in his hand, but he gathered his courage and pointed it into the corner. There was nothing there, just shadows dancing on the walls, but he knew something was there with him, and this night was just beginning. Lucas returned to the living room trying to catch his breath. He sat on the sofa, holding the photo frame in one hand and the cell phone with the flashlight in the other. His mind was filled with questions he couldn't answer. What was that whisper? Why did the sound seem so close, but invisible to his eyes? He looked around, as if hoping that the familiar environment could offer him some security, but the feeling that something was watching him wouldn't leave him. The silence now seemed more oppressive than ever. That's when he noticed something strange. On the coffee table, where he usually left his keys, there was something he hadn't noticed before. A sheet of paper, carelessly folded. Lucas didn't remember leaving it there. Hesitantly, he reached out to pick it up. Carefully unfolding the sheet, he saw that there was something written on it. The words, scrawled in hasty, uneven handwriting, sent a shiver down her spine. "You are not alone." The paper fell from his hands as Lucas's heart raced. He looked around the room, as if expecting to see someone stepping out of the shadows. But there was nothing, just the dim glow of the still-on TV. Suddenly, a sound cut through the silence. Footsteps. They weren't his. They weren't coming from the street. They were inside the apartment. The footsteps began in the hallway, slow and deliberate, as if whoever it was approaching unhurriedly, taking advantage of every moment to increase the terror. Lucas jumped to his feet, backing up to the front door. He turned to the lock, struggling to unlock it, but his hands were shaking so badly he couldn't turn the key. Before he could open the door, the footsteps stopped. The silence returned, thicker and more suffocating than before. Lucas turned his head slowly, his gaze fixed on the hallway. The darkness seemed deeper there, almost solid. It was then that he saw it. A figure, tall, still, standing at the end of the hallway. The contours were indistinct, as if the figure were made of pure shadow. But what terrified Lucas most were the eyes, two bright points fixed on him, filled with something he could not decipher. The cell phone in his hand blinked and went out. The room plunged into complete darkness, and Lucas heard, right next to him, the sound of slow, deep breathing. Lucas was paralyzed. The breathing next to him seemed so real, so close, that he could feel the cold air on his skin. He wanted to run, but his body didn't respond. His mind, however, screamed in warning, "You need to get out of here!" With an almost superhuman effort, Lucas threw himself forward, opening the door with a desperate pull. But as he crossed the threshold, something made him stop. The hallway of the building, which should have been lit by fluorescent light, was completely dark. It seemed like an infinite void, as if the darkness itself was waiting for him. With no other option, he retreated, closing the door again and leaning against it, panting. His mind ran in circles, trying to find a plan. It was then that his eyes fixed on the large mirror on the wall of the room next to the door. The mirror was always there, a decorative piece he barely noticed. But now it seemed strange. Lucas couldn't explain exactly why, but something about the reflection seemed wrong. He forced himself to look, convinced it was just paranoia. In the reflection, the room looked normal, with the couch, the table, and the TV still emitting a faint glow. But when he looked at himself, his blood ran cold. In the reflection, Lucas was standing, just as he was in reality. But the expression on his face was different. His reflection was smiling. It wasn't a friendly or comforting smile. It was a twisted, mocking grin that seemed to mock his fear. The reflection's eyes were fixed on his, as if they had a life of their own. And to his horror, he realized that the reflection was moving, but he wasn't. Lucas slowly raised his hand, trying to test the mirror. He moved it upward, but in the reflection, his hand went down. The reflection was out of sync, acting on its own. Before he could react, the reflection took a step forward, toward the glass. Lucas instinctively backed away, tripping on the carpet. He fell back on his butt, but kept his eyes fixed on the mirror. The reflection was now leaning against the other side of the glass, watching him with a suffocating intensity. Suddenly, the smile in the reflection disappeared. He tilted his head, as if listening to something. Lucas realized too late, the breathing next to him had returned, but now it was accompanied by a low, guttural laugh. When he looked back at the mirror, the reflection was no longer there. He was alone, or at least that's what he wanted to believe. So have you ever heard of stories of couples alone? Leave a comment with what you know about this, and if you believe these stories. Let's continue. Lucas felt the presence. He didn't need to look around. The air around him seemed charged, almost solid, as if something was surrounding him. The silence was broken by the sound of footsteps, but this time they weren't coming from the hallway or from the living room. They were behind him, between him and the empty mirror. He turned slowly, trembling but determined to face whatever was there. The reflection had disappeared, but now a shadowy figure began to form on the surface of the glass, as if the mirror were being filled with a black mist that was condensing into a silhouette. Suddenly, a hand reached out from the glass. It wasn't human. Its fingers were long and gnarled. Its skin looked charred. Lucas screamed, but the sound was swallowed up by the room itself. The figure stepped out of the mirror completely, its eyes glowing with a malignant intensity. "You called, and I came," the creature whispered, in a voice that seemed to be composed of several at once. Lucas tried to run, but his feet were stuck to the floor, as if the house itself had become a trap. The creature slowly approached, each step increasing Lucas's terror. Just as it was about to touch him, the light from the cell phone he was still holding flickered, illuminating the entity's distorted face. Then, as if the device had broken the connection between the two worlds, the figure disappeared, dissolving into shadows that dissipated into the air. The mirror shattered into 1,000 pieces, and Lucas fell to his knees, trying to understand what had just happened. The house was silent again, but he knew it would never be the same again. And now, as he stands there, alone in the destroyed room, the most terrifying thought consumes him. What if it's not over? If this story has captivated you, imagine what else we have waiting for you. Dark stories, terrifying encounters, and secrets that defy logic are coming. Did you like it? Then don't forget to leave your like to show that you also enjoy a good thriller. Subscribe to the channel to follow more stories like this and dive into worlds of mystery and terror. It doesn't cost you anything, but it means a lot to us. And of course, thank you very much for being here and following us until the end of this scary story. Your presence makes all the difference. See you in the next video. Or will the next video come to you? Title of the second story: The Presence. In the locked room, have you ever felt that strange sensation of not being alone, even though you're at home isolated? Imagine spending a night in an old house where every sound, every shadow seems to hide a secret. Today, I'm going to take you to a story that will give even the bravest goosebumps. A locked room, a forgotten diary, and an inexplicable presence. Get ready to find out what happens when the silence of the night is broken by the unknown. If you like stories that defy logic and make your heart race, stay with me until the end. Ricardo parked the car in front of the country house. The sound of the engine turned off quickly, being replaced by the whisper of the wind. Twilight tinted the sky, a dull gray, and the trees around it swayed gently, as if greeting the new visitor. The house, with its peeling walls and opaque windows, looked different in the dim light of early evening, as if it were alive, watching him. He sighed, grabbing his backpack from the passenger seat. He needed some rest, some silence. Work in. The city had been consuming him, and a weekend away seemed like the perfect solution. But as he climbed the creaky steps to the front door, an inexplicable feeling took hold of him. Something like a premonition, a weight on his chest, a tingling that started at the back of his neck and ran down his spine. As he opened the door, the long, mournful creak echoed through the house, and Ricardo shivered. Inside, the air was still, heavy with a smell he couldn't quite identify. It was something between mold and rusty iron, with a bitter note that made him wrinkle his nose. He closed the door behind him, trying to ignore the chill he felt as he did so. As he explored the place, he noticed details that had gone unnoticed during his brief daylight visit. A sinuous crack in the wall, like petrified lightning. The pattern of shadows on the antique furniture that seemed to move with him. And a crooked picture on the wall, showing a landscape that now seemed more bleak than beautiful. He sat on the couch, turned on an old lamp, and tried to relax. The light was dim, barely illuminating the room, and the shadows seemed to come alive around him. He turned on some soft music, trying to break the heavy silence, but the sound seemed almost insignificant compared to the oppression of the house. Then he heard it. At first, he thought it was his imagination, a barely audible whisper coming from deep within the house. But as he concentrated, the sound became clearer, something like the shuffling of footsteps upstairs. Ricardo froze. He was alone, or at least he should have been. The sounds in the darkness. Ricardo's heart hammered in his chest as he remained still on the couch, his ears straining for the sound. It must just be the wind, he muttered to himself, but the excuse sounded flimsy even to him. The shuffling continued, irregular, as if something or someone was moving slowly upstairs. Gathering his courage, he stood up, the wooden floor creaking beneath his feet. Each step seemed to echo throughout the entire house, further enhancing the feeling that he was not alone. He reached for his cell phone to use the flashlight, but noticed that the battery was almost dead. Great, he thought, as the beam of light illuminated the path ahead. "Hello?" he called, his voice low and hesitant. The only answer was silence, and then a sudden sound, as if something had fallen. It came from one of the bedrooms upstairs. Ricardo hesitated. Part of him wanted to run, leave the house and never return. But another part, driven by a mixture of curiosity and disbelief, urged him to investigate. He climbed the stairs slowly, each step emitting a groan under his weight. The hallway was plunged into darkness, and the bedroom doors seemed like portals to the unknown. When he reached the end of the hallway, he noticed that the door to the master bedroom was ajar. He reached out, pushing it slowly, and the beam of the flashlight revealed the interior of the room. It was empty, or almost. On the floor, a chair had fallen over, looking as if it had been recently knocked over. Before he could move, the sound returned. This time, it seemed closer, more urgent. It wasn't just the shuffling of footsteps, it was something deeper, more guttural, like a moan that came from the very heart of the house. Ricardo felt a shiver run down his spine, and for a moment, he had the impression that something was moving in the darkest corner of the room. "Who's there?" he asked, his voice trembling. But instead of an answer, what came was a silence so absolute that it seemed suffocating. Ricardo took a step back, his heart racing as if it wanted to escape from his chest. The darkness in the corner of the room seemed denser, almost palpable, and he swore something had moved there. The flashlight on his cell phone flickered for a moment before focusing on that spot, but the dim light seemed unable to fully penetrate the shadow. He took a deep breath, trying to rationalize the situation. Maybe it was just his nervousness, his imagination playing tricks on his mind. After all, there was no one there. There couldn't be. He took a hesitant step into the room, his eyes fixed on the dark corner. The silence around him was absolute, interrupted only by the sound of his irregular breathing. That was when he noticed something strange on the floor, partially hidden by the fallen chair. Ricardo bent down to pick it up, the flashlight trembling in his hand. It was an old notebook, the leather cover worn with age, with marks that looked like burns. He opened it slowly, the yellowed pages creaking as if protesting the movement. The notebook was filled with handwritten notes, but the handwriting was uneven, almost scribbled. A few words were legible: shadows, trapped, never alone. With each turn of the page, the writing became more confusing, almost frantic, as if the person who wrote them was in absolute panic. In the middle of the notebook, he found a drawing that made his blood run cold. It was a sketch of a room, the same room he was in, and in the dark corner of the drawing, there was an indistinct figure, a shadowy shape with empty eyes that seemed to stare directly at whoever looked at the paper. Ricardo felt his throat dry up. He closed the notebook quickly, as if that would erase what he had just seen. But then, something caught his attention. A sound. A soft murmur coming from the direction of the dark corner of the room. The flashlight trembled in his hand as he slowly turned it, pointing the beam in that direction. His mind fought against reality, refusing to accept what his eyes saw. The shadows seemed to move, to take shape. "You shouldn't be here." The voice was low, whispered, but clearly audible. Ricardo froze, unable to distinguish whether it was coming from inside his mind or directly from that darkness. He backed away, stumbling over the fallen chair, but his eyes never left the shape that now seemed to be approaching. Without thinking, he ran out of the room, almost slipping in the hallway, the notebook still clutched in his trembling hand. Behind him, the sound of heavy footsteps echoed, as if something was following him. As he hurried down the stairs, Ricardo barely realized that, in his escape, he had left the bedroom door wide open. At the top of the stairs, in the dim light of his flashlight, he saw it. The shadow was standing there, motionless, watching him. Ricardo. His name came out in a guttural, drawn-out tone, as if he were being dragged. He screamed, stumbling, on the steps and almost falling, but he didn't stop running. Ricardo ran into the living room, his bare feet slamming against the hardwood floor, as his mind struggled to process what he had seen. He stopped at the front door, panting, his hands shaking as he tried to turn the knob. But the door wouldn't budge. It was as if it were locked from the inside, though he was certain there had been no key there before. His gaze drifted to the windows. The curtains swayed slightly, though the air around him was still, heavy as a thundercloud before a storm. He moved toward one of them, trying to open the locks, but a deafening crash sounded behind him, making him instinctively turn. The sound was coming from the hallway. It was as if something heavy had fallen, but he didn't have the courage to investigate. However, his flashlight, now nearly dead, flickered intermittently, casting unstable shadows on the walls. He didn't want to, but he knew he had to move. It wasn't safe to stay still. Looking around the room, Ricardo saw something that made him freeze. The notebook he had found in the bedroom was now open on the coffee table. Although he was sure he had been holding it during his escape, the pages turned by themselves as if an invisible breeze was stirring them, and stopped abruptly on a macabre illustration. It was the shadowy figure again, but this time the drawing was more detailed. The form had long arms and skeletal fingers that seemed to extend out of the paper. The eyes were empty, but now they conveyed something, a weight, a presence that seemed to penetrate his soul. Suddenly, a low, steady sound began to fill the room. It was a buzzing sound, like a swarm of insects, but it was coming from the hallway. Ricardo felt sweat trickle down the back of his neck as the temperature around him dropped rapidly. Each step he took seemed to echo like thunder in the silent house. When he reached the hallway, he was overcome by the feeling that something was watching. He pointed the shaky flashlight in the direction where he had heard the noise. Shadows danced on the walls, but one of them did not move. It was more solid, darker, and seemed to have a presence of its own. "Why are you here?" The guttural voice echoed again, but this time it was clearer, closer. Ricardo tried to convince himself that it was his mind playing tricks, but he knew something was wrong. He tried to step back, but he felt something cold brush against his leg. Looking down, he saw that the shadow was beginning to spread across the floor, moving slowly towards him, like a stain of ink that swallowed everything in its path. Ricardo stumbled backwards, bumping into the wall, and the shadow seemed to rise, before him taking shape. Now it was not just a silhouette. He could make out the features of a pale, almost translucent face, with sunken eyes that glowed reddish. "You freed me." The sentence came as a whisper that dragged on, but carried a force that seemed to resonate within him. The shadow took a step towards him, its movement slow, as if it wanted to savor every moment. Ricardo screamed, trying to make his way to the kitchen, but he felt something grab his arm. He looked down and saw dark, long, thin fingers wrapping around his skin. The sensation was as cold as ice, but it felt like it was burning, as if the very essence of his energy was being drained. He struggled, pulling with all his strength, and managed to free himself. He ran to the kitchen, locking the door behind him. But he knew that wouldn't stop him. He grabbed the sharpest knife he could find from the drawer, holding it with trembling hands. The whole house seemed alive now. The sound of knocking echoed off the walls, accompanied by whispers he couldn't fully understand. However, one phrase stood out, repeated in different tones, as if several voices were saying at once, "You can't run away." Ricardo backed into the kitchen, his labored breathing mixing with the muffled sound of the knocking coming from the hallway. He closed his eyes for a moment, trying to find some shred of courage, but all he felt was the growing weight of fear, like an anchor pulling him down into the depths. It was then that something caught his attention. In the corner of the kitchen, almost hidden by a worn shelf, there was a small metal door. He had never noticed it before, and considering the years he had spent in that house, it seemed impossible. The door was rusty, with scratch marks that crisscrossed one another like old scars. In the center, a small golden latch reflected the flickering light of the flashlight. Ricardo hesitated. His mind screamed at him to ignore it, to get out of there no matter what, but an inexplicable sensation pushed him toward the door. It was as if something or someone was calling. He knelt down, running his fingers over the latch, and felt an intense cold that seemed to penetrate his skin and reach his bones. "Open up," whispered the same guttural voice he had heard before, but now it seemed to echo from inside his own head. Ricardo swallowed hard. He knew he should stop, but his curiosity got the better of him. With a hesitant tug, he opened the small door. Behind it, there was a safe built into the wall. The safe was an old model with a rotating dial for the combination, and it had a faded inscription that he could barely read. "Some things are best left hidden." The sentence made him shiver, but it also aroused an overwhelming curiosity. Who had left it there, and why? He turned the dial carefully, but realized that the combination was stuck. Before he could think of giving up, he heard a strange click coming from the safe, as if something had unlocked it on its own. The door opened slowly, with a creak that cut through the silence like a blade. Inside the safe, Ricardo found a set of objects wrapped in a dark cloth. As he unrolled the cloth, his vision was invaded by disturbing images. An old photo of a family he didn't recognize, their faces slightly blurred, as if something had altered the image. Next to the photo was a silver locket with a strange symbol, a circle crossed by lines that seemed to converge in the center. But what disturbed him most was a hardcover journal. The cover was worn, and there were dark stains that looked like dried blood on the edges. He opened the first page, and his heart nearly stopped. The words were written in a jagged, almost desperate handwriting. "To whoever finds this, you have freed what was trapped. Now there is only one way out. Run while you still can." Ricardo felt a chill run down his spine. He turned to the next page, but before he could read any further, the diary was ripped from his hands, literally. He saw the object fly into the air and slam against the wall, as if an invisible force had taken control. The air around him seemed to condense, and the atmosphere became heavier. An oppressive energy emanated from the safe, which was now beginning to close on its own. Ricardo tried to retreat, but something inside him insisted on staying. What else was hidden there? What did those objects mean? Before he could make another decision, he heard footsteps, slowly, coming from the hallway, as if something was approaching. But the footsteps were not those of one person. They were multiple, fast, uncoordinated, as if dozens of feet were marching at the same time. He turned in the direction of the sound, the flashlight shaking in his hand. "Who's there?" he shouted, but his voice seemed to be swallowed by the darkness. What Ricardo didn't know was that by opening the safe, he had unleashed something that had been dormant, something that had been waiting for a long time to be released. And now, there was no turning back. Why was that safe there? Who were the people in the photo? And what did the medallion mean? Every second, new questions formed in his mind, but he knew that time was running out. So have you ever heard of stories of couples alone? Leave in the comments what you know about this, and if you believe these stories. Let's continue. Ricardo could barely move. The footsteps he heard in the hallway were now in the next room, accompanied by heavy, irregular breathing. The medallion he held in his hands began to vibrate, emitting a faint, pulsating glow, like the beating of a heart. The sound of the footsteps stopped abruptly, but the silence did not bring relief. It brought even greater fear. Suddenly, a colossal shadow began to form on the wall in front of him, projected by a light he could not identify. The figure was tall, misshapen, with contours that seemed to change constantly. A biting cold filled the room, and Ricardo felt as if he were being watched by something that did not belong to this world. The shadow moved, and darkness began to envelop him. His breath caught in his throat, and the sensation of being pulled by invisible hands almost knocked him over. "Why did you open the safe?" a guttural, slurred voice asked, reverberating in his mind like an avalanche. Ricardo tried to answer, but the words would not come out. He wanted to scream, run, do anything, but he was frozen in place. It was then that the medallion emitted an intense glow, bathing the room in a silvery light. The figure retreated for a moment, letting out a scream that seemed like a mixture of rage and agony. Taking his chance, Ricardo ran away, tripping over his own feet, while the sound of the creature followed him like an endless echo. He didn't know how he got to the street. The cool night air hit him like a slap, and when he looked back, he saw the lights of the house blinking frantically. Then, everything went silent. The house seemed harmless again, but Ricardo knew he would never go back there. As he walked away, something fell out of his pocket, the medallion. He picked it up carefully, realizing that it was now cold and dull. Ricardo looked at the object one last time and threw it down a drain. Maybe, he thought, some things were better buried forever. So, what really happened to Ricardo that night? Did he manage to escape it all, or will something follow him forever? If you were as intrigued as I was, just imagine what's yet to come in the next videos. Here on the channel, the stories are like this, full of mystery, suspense, and chilling moments. If you liked it, don't forget to like it. It's quick and helps us a lot to continue bringing you more horrifying stories. Oh, and of course, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next stories that will keep you awake at night. Activate the bell to be the first to dive into the next mystery. Thanks for watching so far. See you in the next video.